Dziękuję bardzo za zaproszenie mnie do przewodniczenia tej sesji. Let me switch to English at this point. You're all very welcome to this international session on international insights into the public funding of higher education. We've got an excellent lineup of speakers here with us this morning. Just to introduce them very briefly, our first speaker will be Professor Ursula from TU Dortmund University in Germany. She has been rector of the university since 2008, and she's a member of a number of important bodies involved in the management of higher education in Germany. She's a member of the executive board of the National Academy of Science and Engineering. She's the chair of the board of trustees of the Alfred Krupp von Bohlen and Halbach Foundation, and also serves on the board of the High Tech Forum, which is a federal government advisory body. She's also an honorary doctor of Politechnika Łódzka. Her topic will be funding a university in the federal state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Our second speaker will be Professor Bernhard Schrefler from the University of Padova in Italy. He is a professor emeritus in Padova. He is a senior affiliate scientist of the Houston Methodist Research Institute, Hans Fischer Senior Fellow at the Institute of Advanced Study in Munich, and also an honorary fellow of the University of Swansea. He also holds an honorary doctorate from the University of Łódź. Finally, Professor Jussi Kivistö from the University of Tampere in Finland is an adjunct professor in the Higher Education Group Faculty of Management at the University of Tampere, and he's a specialist in the area of the funding of higher education and the administration and governance of higher education, on which he's published nearly 70 publications and edited several books related to higher education administration and management. And his topic will be the financing of higher education institutions in Europe, latest trends and Finnish experiences. I should, by the way, have mentioned that Professor Schrefler's topic will be 10 years of the European Research Council. A few thoughts on the matter. Okay, before we start, just to set the scene for our discussion, I would like to say a few words about the United Kingdom perspective, and the reason for that is obviously partly because I've been working in the United Kingdom for a quarter of a century now, but also because many of the trends in the administration of and financing of higher education in the United Kingdom are very much part of the kind of debate that the Prime Minister has been talking about in the last few minutes, and also which shape that debate in Poland at the moment. So just to introduce those things in some very brief words, the higher education system in the 20th century, in the 21st century, faces a number of challenges and opportunities. First of all, of course, there is a growing demand for higher education globally due to increasing participation levels and also increasing international student mobility, which is becoming a massive factor worldwide. The financial challenges, of course, part of it is the question of education being seen as a public good, which is inevitably, as in consequence, the responsibility of the state. At the same time, however, higher education is a massively competitive industry, and in order to ensure that universities remain competitive, the financial considerations arising out of that are obviously something that any debate on the funding of higher education needs to take into consideration. There are diverse higher education funding models worldwide. So, as I said, at this point, in very brief words, I'm going to say a few words about the UK higher education funding model and some of its implications. So, very briefly, the United Kingdom higher education system includes about 150 universities and comparable specialist institutions, most of which are funded jointly from the public and private sector average, most of which are funded jointly by the public and the private sectors, if you like. At this point, the public sector is responsible on average for 57% of the funding of higher education institutions in the UK. There are 4 separate funding regimes in the UK at the moment. I think the myth of the unitary British system of higher education is no longer true. higher education is a devolved authority in the 3 regions of the United Kingdom which have separate autonomous governments, Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. So the central government at Westminster is at this point only responsible for the financing of higher education in England. Having said this, in the United Kingdom we have nationwide regulatory monitoring and quality assurance systems. So there are issues around the comparability of the funding systems between the 4 parts of the UK, given the fact that the standards that we have to meet in all aspects of the areas of university life have to be the same and have to be and are measured in unitary terms, if you like, across the country. In terms of the higher education funding model in relation to teaching, we've got again a combination of public and private funding coming from the block grant, private funding coming from fees. No fees are payable up front for undergraduate courses. Students are eligible for loans which are repayable after they have graduated and begun to earn a certain level of salary, a certain threshold. There are also maintenance loans and means-tested maintenance grants available, although the details of them vary from country to country and depending on a variety of factors in terms of where students are studying, where they come from, and so on and so forth. Different fee levels apply in different parts of the UK. I haven't got the time to discuss it in detail, but they apply in different ways of different categories of students, part-time, full-time, depending on where they come from, and so on and so forth. Fees are charged for postgraduate courses, although they tend to be lower than for undergraduate studies, and the government does contribute to the cost of postgraduate study up to a point through the block grant. And of course, international students are charged full fees. In terms of the research funding model, we've got a dual funding model which basically relies on a quality-related block grant, which is payable to institutions, and competitive project-based grants, which are awarded for individual projects, including doctoral projects. The block grant allocation is determined by a competitive periodic assessment exercise, currently called the Research Excellence Framework, which assesses the academic work of universities on the basis of their outputs, their research environment, and the impact of the research. The grant system is focused, as I said, on specific projects, doctoral training programs, and other factors of that kind. The funding model is administered, on the one hand, in terms of the block grant, through the 4 separate funding bodies in the 4 parts of the UK. Those funding bodies also cater for key aspects of capital funding. Research grants are administered through 7 area-specific research councils in various areas of subject specialism, such as the Medical Research Council, Arts and Humanities Research Council, and so forth. Student finance is administered by separate funding bodies. What are the current trends and developments? Well, first of all, increasing diversification of higher education landscape, regional differences between the 4 parts of the UK I've already mentioned, and also we've got an emergence of new private higher education providers. That's been a feature of the system over the last 3 or 4 years in particular. They've, since the 1970s or 80s, there was effectively one major private university, the University of Buckingham, but in the last 2 or 3 years, a number of new private higher education providers have been emerging. Government policy favors increasing marketization of higher education, partly through extending financial support available to students studying in private universities, and also through the introduction of competitive mechanisms in terms of both research assessment, which has existed for a number of years, but also a new mechanism of the teaching excellence framework, which is aimed to ensure high quality of teaching and, in fact, to make the level of fees dependent on the quality of the level of fees which are permitted for universities to charge will be dependent on the results of the teaching excellence framework. Increasing significance of league tables is central, obviously, given the competitive nature of the sector, I think universities are now increasingly aware of the way league tables shape student demand and shape the perception of universities, both nationally and internationally. Increasing reliance on international student enrollment is crucial, and in particular at this point, the current policies of the British government, particularly in relation to border control following the referendum in relation to Brexit, are going to be a major factor over the next few years. And finally, a very recent piece of information, a new Higher Education and Research Act was passed in April 2017, which again furthers the process of the marketization of higher education in England through, for example, simplifying mechanisms for the emergence of new private providers, and also through, as I said, linking the potential for fee increases to performance in the TEF. At this point, this bill refers only to England. As I said, it is a devolved responsibility, but I suppose it's widely expected that in due course it will also, similar acts in the same direction will follow in relation to higher education systems in Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. That is really it at this point. Thank you very much indeed. And I'll invite Professor Gather to deliver her presentation. There will not be questions immediately after each of the presentations, but there will be time for questions and discussion after all the three colleagues have presented. Professor Gather.
Thank you so much for your kind introduction. Mr. Minister President, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, I must say that I feel extremely honored to be here with you, to be part of this important and exciting conference on the university system in Poland. So I'm proud also to share some of my experiences with you. Yes, it's all about money, and I would like to tell you a little bit of the university budgets in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia. Doing this, I will touch some points. Namely, I'll touch firstly the university funding system in Germany in general. I'll then look at the higher education system in my state, North Rhine-Westphalia, and then I'll also give you some insight in what we are doing, budgeting within the university, TU Dortmund University. So let's start with the basic university funding in Germany. So higher education and universities are part of the federal structure in Germany. So universities are state institutions, and therefore the basic funding they get is state funding. Then there is also some federal government funding, which usually comes as program funding. Programs like the Excellence Initiative you might have heard about. It's called now Excellence Strategy. There is also the Higher Education Pact, which was mainly introduced to let us cope with the extremely increasing number of students and so on. So this is additional programs. And there's also a small percentage, a small proportion of basic funding which comes from the private sector. So where is North Rhine-Westphalia? Within Germany, it's a western state, as you can see. We have got about 18 million people in our state, compared to Poland, which has 38 million people. Our gross domestic product is something like 650 billion euro. Poland has something like 250 billion euro. But if you look now at the expenditure for research and higher education, we can see that in my state there is 8 billion euro spent for higher education and research, and in Poland it is 6 billion euros. So this is quite an effort in Poland for research and higher education, I must say. So, where is Dortmund? Where is my university? Within the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, it is right in the center. So it is right in the center of the so-called Ruhr area, a former industrial area now, after some structural changes, is more and more going into a high-tech area. Anyway, so how is university funding partitioned? So as I said, there is basic funding coming as a permanent budget from the state, and there is the additional program funding from the federal government by the quality improvement funds and so on. But there is also external research funding, which you have to write proposals for. So this is only gained by competition. So, the grants you can go for are mainly given by the German Research Foundation, the DFG, but of course also from the EU and so on. So if we now look at the distribution of the money we do get at TU Dortmund University, you can see the proportions. But to make this comparable to TU Łódź, where you have the STEM disciplines, of course we are also a technical university, so comparing our STEM discipline distribution, you can see that there's quite a part of the money we do get from external funding. So people write proposals and they get large grants. But of course there is also program funding, which is about 23%, and of course the main part still is what we do get at the permanent budget. So let's look at one aspect of the funding in our state of North Rhine-Westphalia. We don't get everything right away because the Minister of Science takes, firstly, 20% of our budget as an incentive budget. And then we do get some backflow, but only if we perform good and well. And so the backflow depends on performance in teaching, the number of graduates. It depends on our performance in research, and it's easily done just by, third-party money. And it's also 10% equal opportunity, which means they count the number of female scientists. So, to give you an impression of my university, TU Dortmund University, I'll shortly give you some numbers. We are almost 50 years old, so we can celebrate our 50th anniversary next year. We have got by now 34,000 students, and it increased about 60% during I'm leading the university as rector. So this is quite an increase. We have got 300 professors and almost 2,000 people of academic staff. Our total annual, what we spend of money is 300 million euro, and there are 16 faculties, and they are in science, they are in engineering, but there is also some faculties in cultural and social sciences. So, what's our governance structure? And I think this is important when we discuss about money. It is the rectorate which is responsible for the main strategy of the university. So we are responsible for not only the course offer, but also for, defining our research profile, defining our strategy. And of course also for the organization of the university. And last but not least, for the distribution of the budget within the university. The Senate, which is elected by everybody in our university, is responsible to give his opinion on our strategy. It's also responsible for the main, constitution and for defining and, deciding on regulations. The University Council, which is an external organization, is responsible to approve on our strategy. It's also responsible to approve of our financial plans and on our budget distribution. So this is a rough insight in the governance structure of our university. So let me also show you something about budgeting within the University of TU Dortmund. So, of course, there are tasks to be fulfilled, and these tasks need some money. Especially the central tasks, like all leases, facility management, to pay for our buildings, for IT, and main investments. This is an important part. So this is the central task, which is the blue piece of this circle. And then there is also service facilities. That means the central administration, our university library, the IT and media center, and so on. And the service facilities, this is the yellow part, 16% of our budget. And then the main part, of course, we should spend the main part for teaching and research, and this part of the budget is distributed to our faculties. And I'd like to show you how we decided to do this. So, of course, we also started with something like historically grown budgets of our faculties. And we had the goal to overcome these historical grown budgets, namely by distributing the budgets to the faculties on, well, let's say, demand-driven criteria. That is, we wanted to overcome the historically evolved budget and to allocate the sums which the university gives to the faculties by transparent and comprehensible, but also well accepted, which means accepted by our staff, by professors, by the faculties criteria. So how did we do this? Demand-based budgeting of the faculties, that's how we call it. There was the first part which depends on the teaching demand. I'll explain this in some more detail later. And there's a second part of the budget which is given to the faculties by their research performance, that is depending on performance in research. And another part which is just a necessary part to have administration and services within each faculty, and another part which is given for infrastructure, a lump sum. So to go a little bit more in detail, how do we come to what's the teaching demand? Of course, every faculty has a certain teaching demand and a certain teaching capacity which comes out of the courses which have to be offered from and by this faculty. So to pay for the number of hours which have to be taught within this faculty, they get a certain sum. And this sum, of course, also depends on the number of students and the mandatory classes. So this is the teaching demand part of the budget. Then the part which depends on the research performance, this is kind of a basic staffing per professorship. So we think that each professor needs some academic staff, and the better they perform with respect to research, the higher is the number of academic staff they are given. So just to put it roughly. And so the budget is increased for a successful acquisition of external research funding. With respect to administration and services, this is quite easy, just a lump sum for administrative and technical tasks and services, and they do depend on the size and the complexity of a faculty. Of course, like a faculty of chemistry needs all the material and all these glass and so on and so on. So this is somewhat more than a math faculty, for instance, gets. So this is lump sum depending on complexity and also on tasks. And finally, infrastructure and like IT also needs money to be fulfilled. So there's basic requirements that doesn't depend on faculty 1, 2, or 3. So this is just some sum per employee. But also there is research requirements within each faculty. And so there's another part of this infrastructure lump sum which does depend on special faculty needs. And there's another sum per academic employee on top of the basic lump sum. So that is roughly how we distribute our budget, which we get from the state within the university. And to make it short now, I'd like to summarize. We have got the experience and we've come to the conclusion that it's important to cover, of course, the teaching demand, that it's also important to like give some to encourage our professors to write competitive proposals and to be really good in research, of course. So it's a reward for their excellence. And most importantly, we have made the experience that it is important to have a transparent distribution of funds. So if it's all about money, distributing the money, I think it's all about transparency. Dziękuję. Thank you so much.
Rector Magnificus and Mr. Vice Prime Minister. I have to thank you for inviting me here to talk about 10 years of ERC, but mainly I talk about problems which came out both for Poland and also for Italy and possible solutions. Because it's well known now that, or accepted that ERC is a success story, but then so I will show you some data. But then I will also address a little bit the case of Poland and the case of Italy. And then the case of Italy is slightly dramatic, but then to show some solutions which are mainly on the level of universities. The mission of ERC is to reinforce the excellence, dynamism, and creativity of European research, and that has been satisfied. I mean, there's no doubt about that. No, this is just a few data. It started in 2007. The finances go up quite to 2011, and then we hope it go up again, but that is not so sure. Now, where do the... I mean, there was a big demand from some... I don't see the number. Up there you see how many proposals were made, and there were 350 panel members and 2,000 referees to evaluate them. Now, about 6,000 proposals have been accepted, and what I want to show here is down. There are 34% of A levels. That means that they get money. They didn't. I mean, they have been accepted, but they didn't get the money, and that is a resource to taking advantage of that. Now, where does the money go? Mainly to the young, which is important because that is our future. Then there's the starting grants, the consolidator grants, and there are the advanced grants, and they go up to even to 75, but very little. And now that is the first. Where does the money go? To those who have invested in research and development. You see, for instance, over there on top, UK gets more that they invest. Germany is doing right, Italy some way. But if you look at Poland, it's still in the main group, but down. It's, the reason is there are not enough proposals. I mean, I was chair in 2000. 2014 and 2016, and before 3 times in the panel of product and process engineering. And I think I've seen 5 proposals in those 5 years from Poland. That is a big problem. So that is one with investment. Then the next one also, those who have already an excellent science base. Now, again, you see UK is leading, there's Germany, and again, Poland is in the group, but it's still down. Should get more grants, but there are no proposals, or not enough proposals, so that has to be increased. And this one I wanted to show. You see, that is the success rate. And suddenly you see over there 22 and 13% of Switzerland and Israel. Not that they became more intelligent than others suddenly, but they have done proactive policies. And I will address that, because that will help. So now also that is very important. Because you see, UK get by far most grants, but look at the red part, which are British nationals, and the blue part, which are others spending their money in Britain. It's exactly almost the same. Then if you see, and there are few going out, the green one. Then a little bit further, you see Italy. There is roughly the same part of people going out than those spending in Italy, and very few coming in. And if you see down there, Poland is far down there, but again, there are more people going out, so we'll face soon the same problem as Italy. This one I show you because there are also people from outside Europe applying, but that is important because you see in the US, 113, they are all European nationals. I mean, they got the grants, and they will come back because they have to spend 50% of their time in Europe. And I think in US there are as many Poles as there's many Italians there, so that is a reservoir to bring it back also because, I mean, they got the grants, so they can help also to increase the level. Then, okay, this is interesting. If you see the top universities where people spend is in UK, that may be changed with Brexit. Then you see Switzerland, then is Israel, and only down at halfway, there's the first on the continent, which is Amsterdam for life science, for humanities. Then again others, and then come, I mean, think then is Netherlands is doing very well, and the first one is Munich, then from Germany. And there's always said by the young people, it's a lot of work to prepare the grants, but they should remember that it is a big boost for their career. For instance, for those who got the starting grants in 2009, 69, I think, became full professors, then 32 associate professors, so it is, the effort is worth doing it. And that is just, okay, that published, but down there you see that 407 of the grantees got major prizes. It's also here, you see that the EC grantees won 6 Nobel Prizes, 4 field medals, 5 Wolf Prizes, so I think it is important to be there. And that is again the scientific breakthrough that's quite interesting because of the 65 that is in physics, 40 were Europeans, and 15 of them have been also co-financed by ERC. And if you look the list of the last 12 of the last 8 years, you see down at level 5 is the first British institution, but who is the grantee is an Italian. The next one is in Manchester, who is the grantee is the Russian Nobel Prize for graphene, and down on the 12th again. So Britain gets a lot, but if there wouldn't be the foreigners, there would be more British institution there. Okay, that's just to show that thanks to ERC now top quality journal papers are getting overtaking US. And now come to Italy. And, I mean, I said it's a dire situation because, for instance, this is the Consolidator grant, the latest one in 2016. Look, there were 50 Germans got it, and 48 people spent it in German, so this is equal. Italians, 38. Second here, got it, but only 14 spent it in Italy. 24 are out. I mean, it is a loss of money for the country. France is like that, and if you look UK, 24 UK nationals got it, but 58 spent it over there. So, okay, then President of ERC addressed that problem recently at this year, 60 years of Rome Treaty and 10 years of ERC, and showed that Italy got 644 of them, I mean roughly 10%, but only 350 spent it in Italy, and only 30 come from outside. So there's clearly a problem with attractiveness at scientific top level. And he said you should get the basics right, as the minister said. I mean, because Italy spends public sector only 0.53% for research development, well below the average. Then the university of budget is decreasing from 2008 on, when the crisis started, and also there is little overturn. So here you see data. I mean, you see that Italy is down the third last. This is spending for university education. Poland is even doing much better. And here you see the budget for universities. Since 2008, it's always decreasing. We hope now the blue one down is the state spending, so that is going up again. The other are grants. If you see, okay, that is there's the system, how that is subdivided. There are some algorithms, but then there's always political decisions, because if you apply these algorithms, several southern universities of the island, they wouldn't get any money, so that always it's overturned. Here you see the R&D expenditure. First, state expenditure was leading. Now the industry has taken over, and luckily we have also, you see the green one are European money, and there are also some non-profit organization investing. And here you see what happens with the state research grants. And the first row is for the Research Council. We are down back to 2008, and the others are still decreasing. I mean, it's dramatic. Now, is it all black? No, because the universities are reacting. For instance, Padova, they wanted to know, Padova is a quite well-known university, very old university, it's a teaching and research university, wanted to know why all these people go outside, the Italians, and so they launched the research with 83 in-depth interviews, and then on hard sciences in 5 states where people usually go, plus a web survey, and we had 528 valid answers. They wanted to reconstruct the reasons for moving, then the personal journey of the researchers, and to see if there are potential added value for the country. Now the data came out just recently. If somebody is interested, it's quite in. Then the main findings is, because newspapers wrote all it's brain drain, it's brain drain. But they don't see them as brain drain. They say it's normal brain circulation. They do science where you can do it better. Because lack of opportunities at home and better scientific working conditions elsewhere prevent many from returning. Only 3% said they were sure to return. 61 said they won't return at all, and the other one are still not decided. But all wanted to be a resource for the country. It means they accept PhD students, they are partners in European projects, because there are 2 questions down. If they are consider them as a resource, and if they consider them as a resource, but they don't consider them as recognized. So the key suggestion is to become a resource. They should be recognized. There should be a register. I mean, to know who is out. And then for Italy, the problem is also open hiring system, which is open for both Italian and non-Italian scientists. After that, we have quite a proactive rector. Last year, he started writing to many young grantees of starting grants, offering them better employment conditions, and they're coming back. I mean, there are already a few coming to Italy. And now, this email is from 2 weeks ago, sent it out. They said the University of Padova is seeking outstanding PIs for the next ERC starting grant. and then he says, application can be made in any field of research. It's make the University of Padova, its 32 research departments, very attractive for scholars of all disciplines. And here comes the benefit. The best employment condition, PIs funded by the ERC, hosted by the University of Padova, will be offered a tenure track position as assistant professor, associate professor, immediately. Then they have a unique opportunity of work side by side with excellent groups. There are already 28 ERC projects, innovative first-class research facilities, and what is important is all this support, also already for writing the project. Because, okay, then we said, luckily we have also some non-profit organization in Padova. It's one of the third largest bank foundation, and it finances every year about 8 million euros. 4 million goes to fellowships and 2.7 to excellence proposals. They have the same criteria as DRC, and directors pushing youngsters to apply there as a training base for ERC grant. So the conclusions that ERC is inspiring reforms in Europe. For instance, I come back to what I said at the beginning, 17 countries have introduced initiatives to finance their best unfounded applicants. What I said, those who get A but didn't get founded. Many say there's no need that they are evaluated again. They try to evaluate them, to finance them directly or find matching funds. And the second conclusion is that ERC is reshaping European research landscape, there's no doubt. Then appropriate actions are needed for non-staying behind, and such actions are generally to success. For instance, APFL, before ERC, it was the small sister of ATH, then they had a very proactive rector, and they were suddenly so successful that in 2011, it was the single university who got the most ERC grants, so that the commissioner, Potocznik, went there to see what they were doing. And they are offering also what Padova is offering now. I mean, better position, a faster track, and if you are at EPFL, you don't have an ERC, you are not out, but I mean, they don't count. Israel the same. I know that if they have a successful application, but even they are not successful, they get at least at Technion 5,000 euros each time. So there is an incentive for making the proposals, and I think that helps. Thank you very much.
Mr. Minister and Deputy Prime Minister, dear rectors, Polish friends, participants, and students, I'm here to offer you a short description of the latest European trends in financing higher education institutions in Europe. And at the same time, I will offer you Finland as a case example and how some of these trends are being implemented in my own country. But before doing this, I just want to say to you that the European trends are not definitely the only criteria to evaluate the strengths and weaknesses of any national funding model. So what's good and popular in Europe does not automatically mean that it's good or suitable for each of the countries. But nevertheless, funding models, of course, which are applied in other European countries, always give you important insights, what's going on in other European countries, which can definitely help in designing your own models. I was given a 30-minute time slot, but the ruthless clock down there says that I have 13 minutes left from my presentation, so I need to hop a couple of slides. So I'm sorry about that, but hopefully the presentation will be made available for you by the conference organizers after the presentation. So first about Finland. Finland is one of the most publicly funded higher education systems in the world. Depending on the year, we are always on the top 3 in OECD statistics. Either it's Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland, and now in latest years also Estonia has been really high in terms of public spending. We have 14 universities, 23 universities of applied sciences, which are also known as polytechnics. All of them are technically public institutions. Legal status of the 2 universities is private, and all the universities of applied sciences are private, but basically they are public institutions. So there's no private higher education providers which would offer reliable and good qualified credentials in terms of degrees in Finland. We have 2 separate funding models for the both sectors, but they are increasingly similar year after year, but they are still separate ones. And a little bit about the figures. So 2017, meaning this year, universities received 1.8 billion euros, and the polytechnics, University of Applied Sciences, received 835 million euros. Finland is probably one of the most performance-based oriented countries in the world. So if you want to see a country which has the ultimate performance-based funding models, please come to Finland. And I will show you at the later stage of the presentation why this is so. We have performance agreements with the Ministry of Education and Culture and higher education institutions, which are valid for 4-year periods. And they are really important mechanisms for dialogue between the ministry and institutions. So these are really something they negotiate. So it's not only about the ministry who is saying that you should do this or that, but it's a matter of negotiation between the ministries and universities. We have no tuition fees for domestic students, but now, as of this fall, we start to charge tuition fees from non-EU students. The legislation states that the fee must be at least 1,500 euros per academic year, but there's no upper limit, so institutions are able to collect as high fees as they want. And we can already see a drop in the application numbers in most of the Finnish universities and universities of applied sciences from foreign students because we have implemented the policy. We have a relatively generous student aid policy, so we have means-tested study grant, which are means-tested based on personal income of the students, state guaranteed loans, which can be forgiven partly if you graduate fast enough from the universities, housing supplement, and meal subsidies for students. So I think it's something like 65% of the students are receiving the grants, and those who are not receiving earn too much money to receive it. So Finland provides very good assistance for the students. This shows you the overall picture of the funding model. So the upper circle describes you the 2 of the allocations model, which I will present later on. And the lower circle shows you the funding coming from or through Academy of Finland, which is the main research financing body of Finland. And now about the European trends, I will go this presentation according to the four categories or dimensions. And this picture shows the reality of the European higher education institutions at the moment and how much funding they are able to receive from public purses. And as we can see, there are great differences. So leading countries in terms of public spending are Estonia, as I already said. They are now on the top 3 every year. Finland, 1.8%, Austria, 1.7%, Denmark, 1.7%, Norway and Sweden, 1.5%. And countries of higher level of private expenditure were in 2013 United Kingdom, 0.8%, Hungary, the Netherlands and Portugal, all 0.5%, and Latvia, 0.4%. In Europe, the lowest level of expenditure was in Italy, 1.0%, and Slovak Republic, 1.1%. Polish expenditure in total, this 1.4%, is very close to the European average, and I'm happy to hear that this is the plan for the government in future years to also to raise the level of expenditure. If I remember correctly, the European Commission's recommendations is somewhere like 1.5% for all European countries. And then a little bit about the changes, about the share of the public expenditure. This is another way to look at the funding levels in Europe. As we can see from this table, most of the European countries, the share of public expenditure on higher education institutions from public sources has been decreasing, as are indicated by the red downward arrows. Only in few countries, which are in this table highlighted with green upward arrows, Poland being one of them, Share of public funds have increased steadily since the crisis year of 2008. Overall, this table indicates that the share of private expenditure in higher education institutions has been growing in many European OECD countries over the past decade. However, in non-OECD countries where the share of public expenditure has been lower than in Europe, the trend has been slightly the opposite. And now talking about the financial autonomy, which is a very important issue related to the funding questions. So the European University Association, also known as EUA, has developed an autonomy tool to measure the level of autonomy of European higher education institutions. And one of the 4 dimensions in this tool is the financial autonomy, which basically is measured by the type of funding they receive, their internal freedom to allocate the funding as they see fit, their ability to keep a possible surplus at the end of the financial year, borrow money from the financial markets, own buildings, and set the level of tuition fees. And as we can see from this figure, almost in all European systems, higher education institutions receive their funding as a block grant or lump sum budget, which should then give institutions technically also the internal freedom to allocate the government grant as they see appropriate. However, almost in half of the system, the government still restricts in one way or another the internal use of the grant, which in a way goes against the principle of financial autonomy. Similarly, almost in all systems, higher education institutions can keep a surplus at the end of the year, but again, in 45% of the systems, there are some restrictions related either to keeping or using the surplus. Higher education institutions' ability to borrow or own their own buildings is possible in most of the higher education systems in Europe, but only with restrictions. Only in 8 European systems out of 30, higher education institutions can borrow freely, and in 10 systems, they can sell their buildings without restrictions. Regulation of the tuition fees is much higher, as we can see from the figure, when it comes to the domestic students in the bachelor's and master's level, but in many countries, universities are allowed to set the fee levels for foreign students coming outside the EU region. And now this offers you a comparison between the level of autonomy in Finland and in Poland according to the EUA framework. And there are not many differences, actually. But to some extent, Finnish institutions are a bit more financially autonomous than the Polish ones at the moment. So altogether, Finland ranks in number 11th and Poland number 21st in the level of financial autonomy among the European countries. And as we heard a moment ago, this is quite likely to be, to some extent, changed in the future years. So in this way, Poland would be following the European trend. And then the public allocation models. Now, this is a picture which shows you one way how the funding models can be grouped or categorized according to their internal logics and the context of their use. One of the ways to understand the dynamics of the models is to make a distinction between the goals attached to the modalities. And in almost all countries, there are elements in the funding model which are aimed in one way or another to promote long-term stability of the system. That's the Pillar 1 funding, which is the green one. And usually this is the largest part of the funding. And then you have also in many systems second pillar called performance-based funding, the blue one, which is increasing the efficiency and productivity of the system. And then you have the third pillar, the blue pillar, which is focusing on excellence, innovation, and profile-oriented funding for strategic profiling of the higher education institutions, which is more promoting change and development. It can be channeled either through the regular funding model or then through the funding agencies like the Academy of Finland or both of them. And in many countries, governments use some sort of performance contracts, either implicit or explicit, with the higher education institutions. But the most explicit contracts are still not so well represented among the European countries, so this is definitely something which I would consider still underutilized possibility, both for the governments and for the higher education institutions. By the way, I don't have a clock here, so I don't know anything about the time. So if the technical people could bring the clock back, I could then follow the progress of my presentation. Or if the black screen means that I can talk as long as I can, then that's fine. So that's okay to me too. So, but the Pillar 1 basic funding can be described, as I said, as an amount of funding which is really there for offer the stability and predictability. It's really intended to cover the cost of the basic activities related to the education and teaching. Mainly it's related to the salaries, which often comprise or make up 50 to 70 or even 80% of the cost of higher education institutions. Mostly it should fund the cost of infrastructure, thereby allowing higher education institutions to perform their core tasks. As it was previously discussed in the context of financial autonomy, most European systems distribute the basic funding to higher education institutions through block grants, even though they contain restrictions. The overall amount of the block grant may be determined in different ways, through negotiation, incrementally, on a historical basis, which is becoming more and more rare, or with funding formula, which is an algorithm. And if you use funding formula, the most well-known or utilized indicators are related to the student numbers, and then also staff numbers are included there. So these are like the main inputs of the production process of the higher education institutions, which can be then utilized as drivers for allocating the resources. And then the second pillar, performance-based funding. As we all know, it's an allocation mechanism where the amount of funding is tied to products or outputs of higher education institutions, and in this way, higher education institutions receive funding more or less on the basis of what they produce rather than what they are. Already a half of the European higher education systems use some kind of performance-based funding approach, although what constitutes as a performance-based funding is very differently understood in European countries. And the trend seems to be that the number of these systems is increasing year after year. In the side of the education, most typical performance indicators are related to graduation of the students and their progression in their studies, whereas in the side of research, the most typical indicators are related to the amount of research funding received, thereby creating a double incentive for institutions to seek additional research funding. And now, this is the super performance-oriented funding model of Finnish universities. As you can see, well, first of all, universities receive 60 to 65% out of their money on average based on this model. And as you can see, the performance indicators comprise altogether 39% from education and 36% of research. So that's a really high share of funding which is allocated based on the performance criteria. And we have 12 indicators in Finland. Most important ones are related to the graduation of the students, either master's degrees, bachelor's degrees, or doctoral degrees, but actually doctoral degrees are categorized as a side of research, in the side of research. And then very controversial indicator is this number of students who are able to complete 55 ECTS annually. So this is an indicator which tries to speed up the process. Not only that people graduate, but they actually graduate fast. And then I also heard from the minister's speech that you are planning to implement the employability indicator. Well, in Finland it's already in use, but it's very small proportion of funding compared to the other indicators. It's only a 1%. And now the ministry has actually developed the indicator in a way that it is able also to take into account the qualitative in employability, not only quantitative. So this is really important because if you are graduating from the law program and then going to work to the McDonald's, you are definitely in a position where you should be. And this was one of the criticisms from the part of the universities, that this is biasing the measurement, and now we have a graduation survey implemented for the students, and then we are finding information from there, getting information from there whether the students feel that they have been actually employed in positions where they should be after the graduation. And one of the first countries in Europe, it's not already visible here, but we will also in Finland implement the employability indicator of doctoral students, meaning that when you graduate from the doctoral studies, then universities also receive part of the funding based on the employability of doctors, which has become a problem in Finland because I would say almost overproduction of the doctoral degrees. And one of the reasons is this model, which is actually putting really high emphasis on the production of doctoral degrees. So then we go to the model of the university. Sorry, there's also a lower section here, which is then the money which is not so transparent because it's not allocated through the formula. It's a strategic funding, it's 12%, and this is really the golden egg our ministry has to steer and guide the universities, because majority of the funding is automatic in a way based on the results universities are able to produce. But the strategic development funding is something which is negotiated with the ministry and between the institutions. And our ministry, in my point of view, has made the correct decision that if the strategies are not good enough, they won't provide the funding. So they are not tied to spend all the 12%, but it can be postponed or transferred to another year. And this has really speeded up universities' ambitions to say something real in their strategies, also other than just being the world-class leaders in everything, but also to make some substantial choices and selections of profiling what they want to do or don't want to do. And then it's about the ministry's decision whether they want to finance these projects they are offering for the ministry. And then there are two other elements there which are then stabilizing factors. So this model needs to take into account some specific very expensive fields and special activities of the universities which they need to do, and they don't get compensated if they don't have their own funding criteria. And this is then the funding model for the Universities of Applied Sciences. As you can see, the outline of the model is pretty much the same as for the universities. The crucial difference is that the education part of the model is super emphasized. It's almost 80%. And the bachelor's degrees from the University of Applied Sciences, and then the number of students who graduate, number of students who have the 55 ECTS within a year comprise altogether 63% of the funding. So really powerful indicators. And the rest of the model is more or less, of course, important for the institutions, but not so high-weighted elements. One aspect with this in this model, also the previous one, is this student feedback. And this is an indicator of quality. And it's also very debatable whether you should actually collect feedback on students and then link funding to these results. And our government has taken the, let's say, I would say a little bit controversial step in this aspect. So most of the experts would say that you shouldn't link the feedback results with the funding model. But, well, our policy has been, yes, very... so I have a time limit because the clock is not working. I thought that basically I've given some mercy here. Okay, then we go to the pillar 3. This is really a broad category of funding, which covers almost anything related to innovations, profile-oriented funding, and excellence. Usually, in many countries, it's allocated under schemes such as strategic funding, competitive funding, excellence schemes, centers of excellence, alongside with other mechanisms of the Research Council funding. It can be allocated to individual researchers, research groups, or then the institutions. But the idea really is to promote change, excellence, or innovations, and this funding comes on the top of the regular funding. So it's not something that is sliced off from the basic funding and then allocated differently, but usually this is an extra investment for the sector. So you just don't pour more money for the sector, but you invest for the future activities, which bring something new and important for the country, and this kind of pillar is used for that. I need to go a little bit faster here. This now shows you actually how the three pillars are divided in the basic funding model. And as you can see, the size, relative size of the pillar 1 and 2 are really small in Finland. In other countries, you could change the pillar 1 and 2 in terms of how much funding is allocated based on them. But this is now the Finnish case, which is pretty unique. Something about the fees and student support. I can say only this, that I would have had several slides after this showing what's the situation, but there seems to be that there is no general trend in EU in terms of tuition fees and in terms of student aid. So in some countries, fees are being introduced. In some countries, they are being abolished. Apparently, Germany doesn't know what to do. I mean, many of the states are either introducing or not introducing the fees. At the moment, there's no fees at all. I believe that, but there's ongoing discussion in some of the states, I guess, whether they should be introduced or not. Finland introduced the fees for the foreign students, but definitely not for the domestic students. And you can find varieties of systems of student support, providing direct support in form of grants, which can be allocated either need-based or merit-based. Then you have loans, different types of them, and also indirect ways of supporting, like tax deductions and so on. So I would say it's, in a way, very diverse. So there's clearly no other trend than the growing diversity in European countries. So that's something which is pretty evident when you look at the pictures which are available and figures which are available from different countries. But maybe I believe that I have the time limit and I need to stop here. And as I said, there would have been some slides showing what's the situation in different countries, and I hope that the organizers will provide you the presentation that you can see them by yourselves. Thank you.
Can everybody hear me? Yeah, lovely, thank you. Thanks very much to my three colleagues for the very interesting presentations, which I think have addressed quite a number of issues that we have all been thinking about in relation to the funding of higher education, and a number of the questions that are currently facing Poland have been addressed, using the examples of the various countries that my colleagues and I have been talking about. We've got about 20 minutes for discussion and questions, so I would first of all ask, are there any questions at this point coming from the audience? There are some microphones which can be passed on to people. So yes, there is a question over there. There is a gentleman here on the left. Sorry, are there microphones? A gentleman here in the second row. Could a microphone be passed to them?
Can I start? Or?
Yeah, please, yeah.
I have a question about England presentation, about long-term financing of scientific equipment and institution. How often you perform evaluation of those institutions? How often you take the decision to stop granting, on to increase granting, on to cut, and so on? So, because this is extremely important for our basis. If you like to increase our scientific output and to attract some good students, we need to have a good basic.
Right, okay. The position is that, as I indicated in my presentation, there are two different sources of research funding in the UK. In terms of the grants which are specifically related to projects, they are funded on a non-going basis. So there are, rounds of invitation, bids for applications, happening, every 6 months or every year, depending on which particular research council or which particular private funder we are talking about. Now, in terms of the block grant, which is awarded through an assessment exercise, they used to be called research assessment exercises. The most recent one was called Research Excellence Framework. They happen periodically. The last one, the Research Excellence Framework, covered the period from 2008 through to 2013. and the results were published in December 2014. And the level of public funding for universities in terms of the block grant, which is quality determined, will depend on when the next exercise comes forward. The current speculation is that it's probably going to happen in 2020. So we are talking, broadly speaking, about 6-7 year periods. And at that point, over that period of 6 years, the funding of universities would be determined by the results of the most recent assessment exercise. And then, the position would change the next time a research assessment exercise is carried out, and then for the next 6-7 years, whatever those things change practically every cycle. But the level of block grant is determined, as I said, for a period of about 6 or 7 years when it comes to the block grant. Okay? The gentleman here, yeah.
Jędrzejewski, University of Białystok. I have two questions. One is to Professor Gatter about the German system. 20% of block grant is incentive-based, and what about the 80%? It is historically evolved, but could you say more about that? And about this 80% of the block grant? Because 20% is incentive-based, and the rest is, the larger part is, as you said, historically evolved. No? Okay, and my second question is to Professor Kivistö about the publications which are incentive in the block grants. How these 4 categories are evaluated by the place of publication, or by citation, or by some expert evaluation? Thank you.
Maybe this is a misunderstanding. There is no part within our internal budgeting which is still historically based. So it's all distributed by criteria, by teaching demand, by research performance, and by lump sums for administration and infrastructure. Or did I get your question wrong?
Actually, I meant the external funding. So the external funding.
The external funding, that is how the state funds the universities, this is historically grown. Right now they are working on a strategic budgeting of the universities, but the budgeting the universities get from the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, this is somehow overrolled every year. So this is historically grown.
Yes, yes, the publications indicator in the funding model. So we have 3 levels of publications, 3 being the highest one, and then actually, well, 4 levels because 0 is the lowest one. How it's made up, which of the publications belong to which category, the answer is that we have a national panel making the decision, and they take a variety of issues into account, not only the impact factor of the journals or publication series, but also the field-specific aspects related to publication. So the publishing patterns are very different, let's say, in history than in biomechanical engineering. And so it's decided by a national panels. I think the period for each of the categorizations or classifications is for 3 years. The system is pretty much similar to what is happening in Denmark and in Norway, and we actually more or less copied or adapted the system from Denmark and Norway to Finland.
Okay, thank you. Stefan Jackowski, University of Warsaw. I have 2 questions to Professor Gatter and Professor Kivistö, and both consider facility management. So I understand in the first case, in the German case, the university owns its building and they are centrally managed. So the question is, how do you allocate space to various programs or departments? Can you rent the spare space on the free market? And the question to Professor Kivistö is, well, Finland is, I think, one of the few countries where universities do not own their buildings, and there is a special agency which at least manage the building. So I would like to ask you about the Finnish experience with this completely different solution. How does it work? Thank you.
Okay. Well, in North Rhine-Westphalia, usually the universities do not own their buildings. They are given a budget and they do rent, so they lease the buildings from the state. There is only one exception, which is the University of Cologne. So this is an experiment. This university owns its buildings, and which also means that they have to come up for all kind of facility restoration and keeping them well in shape. So usually we do not own, but we pay the leases from the budget we get from the state. But we are also allowed to rent other rooms. Because of the increase of students, we really had to do that. The buildings which we were given for usual lease, they weren't sufficient. So around the campus, we are also renting more buildings.
Yeah, this is really a special arrangement in Finland. I'm glad you raised it because, well, I don't know if it's an agency or should we talk about a company, because basically in any way universities own the company collectively, which again owns the buildings. So it's like indirect ownership of the buildings. And the reason why this was done so is to share the risks related to the buildings. When you have really expensive maintenance of the buildings, let's say renovations, so the costs are shared between the universities which own the buildings, or the company which again owns the buildings together. How this turns out to be in the long run, I'm not sure, because it's technically the law allows universities to own their own buildings, and this was basically the university's own decision that they don't want to own their own buildings directly, but indirectly through this company or agency.
Lucyna Woźniak, Medical University of Łódź. First question to Professor Gatter about the structure of the university. It seems that the structure of your university is very similar to the Polish ones, except of one thing. This is a University Council or Hochschulrat. Can you please tell us something about the structure of this body, about function, and about people and institutions which constitute this body? This is to you. And the other question goes to Professor Schrefler. You were talking a lot about ERC grantees, but to get the ERC grantee, we need a proper environment to create these people, to build up their competences, their CVs, speaking brutally. So can you give us some advices coming from your university, how to build up this kind of friendly pro-ERC environment? Thank you.
Yes, thanks for your question concerning the university councils. Almost in every state in Germany there are university councils by law, and it's somewhat different how they are elected and chosen. In North Rhine-Westphalia, it's the universities themselves which make the suggestion how they are constituted. So in my university, it's also the number is somewhat free. The law says between 8 and 12 people have to be elected by the Senate of the university, and there's a small search committee to look for appropriate persons. So by law, the council members have to come from all parts of society, that is from industry, from business, from culture, maybe even church, and also unions. So there should be a representation of personalities in our society. They should be extremely experienced and people who do know something about science, research, and higher education. So elected by the Senate, approved by the state government, but they usually do approve it's only very rare exceptions when they do not approve of the suggestion made by the Senate of a university. Now, the tasks, they control the rectorate. That is, they have to approve the business plan for the next year. They have to approve the financial report of the year which is just ended, and they also approve of the university development plan. That is the main strategic thoughts of the rectorate. But it's not that they control in a, let's say, a very severe manner. They are more a sparring partner and counsel than a controller. So I could summarize it like this.
Okay, first a comment. Poland has an excellent science base because I mean I had this project Tempus Far. Then my best co-workers here in the audience, Darius Gavin, I have 70% of my papers with him. We got prizes for that. Okay, so I was amazed when I was in Brussels not to see projects. I have seen very, very little. So, but there were also in Padova the same problem at the beginning. The youngsters didn't want to do that. So one action was to recall by the rector people who had won Italians outside to offer them an advantageous position, and that then helps. And then we started local funding schemes to build them up in the same way as the DRC. So they are trained to do that. I mean, it's the double evaluation and referees from outside, nothing to do with university. And so they are trained and now they are starting. So, okay, as I said, you need proactive politics, but then it works. I mean, it worked with EPFL, as I said. There was nothing at the beginning and suddenly Israel, yeah, okay.
Łukasz Sulkowski, Jagiellonian University. Actually, I have a question to Professor Kivistö about the construction of the system of the incentives for public universities. I mean, in this moment in Poland, we have the one strong proactive pro-quality performance indicator, which is the number of the students per academician. Having the, let's say, the new regulations, when we will split in between of the three different missions of research university, missions of applied science and education university, and third one, which is educational one, we should look for the other important performance indicator to build it in the system that we are calling here in Poland the financial algorithm. Yeah? And the question is about your opinion. What kind of the crucial financial indicators can be useful for these different three types of the universities? And actually, there is also the difference, because in Finland, you have only two types of the universities. You have research and applied sciences, no, let's say, this track of the educational, which in Poland probably must exist in this moment. And my second observation and the question, I would like to hear the comment. The system is a bit too complicated, I think. In Poland, introducing such a complicated criteria of the differentiation for so many performance indicators, probably it will be tough to understand in this moment. Now we have one performance indicators. Maybe we will have, let's say, a few, but not such a large number. Thank you very much.
Coming to your last point, I would say that this didn't happen overnight, what we saw in Finland. So we started the performance-based funding already in 1995. So the system is 22 years old in universities, and this is an organic development. So if you make really radical sudden changes, it's not usually good for the system in terms of the funding. So you need to have continuity, or at least then the buffers which are allowing the maximum fluctuation of the institution funding of the institutions. But coming to your questions, what would be the good indicators for the three institutions? I think there are no new indicators to be invented anymore. So, for instance, the European University Associations has already categorized all the indicators related to the teaching and research. missions, except in the, let's say, social impact or engagement. This is still an area where there's a development of indicators coming up. But rather than saying to you what indicators you should use, I would offer you the same recommendations I did for my own government and I did for the Latvian government in the World Bank team. And that would be that you would have a pool of indicators where the institutions could self-select together, maybe with the ministry, those indicators which are more appropriate to their mission and profile. So this would be then a solution which doesn't fit all the universities or colleges or universities of applied sciences to the same form, but it allows some flexibility in terms of the institutional missions. And actually, my own government didn't follow the recommendation. As you can see, it's one size fits for the all. Also, the Latvian government at the moment, they have a performance-based funding system which is implemented, but it doesn't still include the institution-specific indicators. But what I know, not for sure, but what is my assumption, what will happen in Finland after 2 to 3 years, that the ministry starts also measure the impact of the social engagement of the universities in one way or another. And for this mission, the definite solution would be to allow different kind of aspects of this social engagement. For instance, some institutions might have a really close connections with the industry and they're doing many things together. In some other institutions, they are more socially responsible with their projects and so on. So this is something which will happen quite likely in Finland. So there is no decision from our government yet, but this is something what I would estimate to happen within the time period of the next 4 years.
Thank you. One last question here in the middle.
Yeah, thank you very much. Mirosława Elfrey from University of Szczecin. A year 2003 was very important for the joining the European research area. So we entered the Bologna process and then we got several situations of making the alliances of different universities and proposing the new schemes of their activities. So from this perspective, how do you see the financing model of research and the education in your countries? Because I think that in a case when we are now implementing these new regulations, we would like to hear how long it took in your countries to to get to this point where you are, because I'm frankly surprised that the private contribution in Germany at your institute, at your university, is very low, while in the case of, for example, Ghent University, 19.5% of the private funding is given. So then my question is rather to hear the comment from this perspective of several years. How do you think it affected your current financing policy, the Bologna process and the era?
Thanks for your question. You are absolutely right. We are claiming a more stable and permanent part of the budget of the universities. In fact, this is an implication of the federal structure of higher education. The states, let me say, are somewhat poor, so the state budget is somewhat low, and to cope with the increasing number of students, it has been the federal government who came up with programs to overcome the need for more money to cope with the increasing number of students. And right now, the universities are, of course, claiming to take and give this part of the program money into the permanent funds for the universities. And this is just changing because the federal structure with respect to higher education has been given up somewhat. So the law is allowing the federal government to give more money to universities. So we are all hoping for a larger part of permanent budget to fund the universities and to increase, for instance, the number of professors for the students who have been, the number of students have been so increasing. So we really do need more permanent budget. So thanks for that question.
Just a short comment. In Italy, it took a few years to implement the Bologna, because it was coming from Bologna, especially in engineering faculties, they were against at the beginning. But then it has been implemented. The only thing that we start again, also mathematical engineering 5 years course, which goes backwards. So.
Yes, I see only a remote distance between the research area, European research area and European higher education area and our funding models. But I can say at least two aspects related to this. First of all, including bachelor's degrees as a funding criteria is definitely a thing for the universities, because in the old times we only had the master's degrees. So students could actually graduate without having the bachelor's degree taken out, so to speak, only just before, right after they graduate for the master's degree. So it was only formality that they actually had the certificate, because in universities the bachelor's degree doesn't give you the labor market qualification. Now that's changing to some extent due to the Bologna process, but this is one of the reasons why also our ministry wanted to incentivize universities that also the bachelor's degree matter, not only the master's degree. The second aspect is related to the research funding, amount of competitive research funding, and how it's rewarded by the funding model. So part of this indicator or criteria is related to how much EU funding our universities are able to generate, and competitive research funding in general. And that's, as I said in my presentation, is a double funding in a way that you get extra funding because you already have the funding. And it's expected to stimulate also the research activeness in the higher education institutions, specifically in universities.
Finally, in the United Kingdom, the implementation of Bologna wasn't really much of a problem, because the traditional UK system involved a 3-year bachelor's followed by a 1 or 2 year master's. So it wasn't really a major issue. Now, in terms of the changes to the funding regime, though, I suppose the current position which has evolved over the last 15 years, or specifically in relation to the fees, up until about the beginning of this century, there were no tuition fees charged for undergraduate programs, and it was only initially in the early 2000s that a tuition fee of £1,000 a year was introduced across the country. Then it moved up to 3,000. Now in England, for the last 5 years or so, the level of fee has been 9,000. But because of the diversity of the systems between the 4 countries of the UK, we are now in a very mixed kind of environment, to the extent that Scotland, for example, doesn't charge any fees of undergraduates, but it does charge fees of undergraduates from England, Wales and Northern Ireland. So it is something of a bizarre and not necessarily equitable arrangement. But obviously at this point, I suppose all considerations to do with the funding of higher education in the United Kingdom are really centered around the impact of Brexit and the impact of government policies in relation to immigration, because obviously Brexit by definition, the figures that we saw earlier today about the significance of European research funding for British universities are self-evident, and the results of the way in which the government and Europe will or will not negotiate the terms of Brexit will dramatically affect the funding position of universities. And of course, the government's position in relation to immigration legislation, again, will massively impact on the levels of international students coming into the country. And universities in Britain have massively depended on international students in recent years. Only in the last few months, major universities, Manchester, for example, has announced staffing cuts of over 150 academic posts. And that demonstrates the level of anxiety in the UK system, resulting largely from concerns about immigration legislation and the impact of international student numbers, as well as of Brexit. Now, I think that's about as much time as we have for this session. So could I, at this point, thank my colleagues for their presentation and for their contributions to the discussion, and thanks to everyone who has contributed as well. Many thanks, everybody.